Welcome, everybody. Today's Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent, and we're moving into the Old Testament in our readings from the Bible story by William Neal. Today's chapter is a sort of introduction, chapter 30, called The World into Which Jesus Came. Before we look for an answer to the question at the end of the last chapter, let us first try to see what the world looked like at the time of the birth of Jesus. The first clue is given in St. Luke's account of the Christmas story, when he says, "Now at this time Caesar Augustus issued a decree for a census of the whole world to be taken." The whole world in this case meant the Roman Empire, which stretched from the Atlantic to Arabia, from Britain to the Sahara. The great Persian Empire had been overthrown by Alexander the Great, and his Greek Empire had now given place to the rule of the Caesars. This was what counted as civilization. Beyond it were the barbarians. At the birth of Jesus, there was peace almost everywhere within the empire. The authority of Rome, backed by mobile legions and strategic garrisons, provided the world with a welcome respite from war. For almost a century around this time, a man could travel from end to end of the empire without a passport by using the marvelous system of arterial roads. Merchants, officials, soldiers, and private citizens passed along these highways in an endless stream. In due course, Christian missionaries had cause to be grateful for them as a means of spreading the gospel. Yet the empire, although Roman in name and government, was still Greek in character. The legacy of Alexander the Great had been the culture and civilization of Athens. The Roman conquerors had themselves been conquered by the power of Greek ideas. Most significant of all was the fact that basic Greek had become the international language. People still spoke their own native tongues, and Latin was the language of officialdom. But whether it was Asia Minor or North Africa, Italy or Spain, Greek was spoken and understood. Again, this was something which was of prime importance in the early days of Christianity, when St. Paul, for example, was as easily understood in Ephesus as in Rome. It was an educated world, with schools and universities on the Greek pattern, and cities where the architecture, dress, and manners would have made an old Athenian feel very much at home. In Palestine, however, it was a different story. While the rest of the world enjoyed the Roman peace, in Judea there was tension and guerrilla warfare that led to open revolt. While Greek culture was welcomed everywhere else, in Jerusalem it was passionately resisted. The horror of the time of Antiochus IV was still fresh in Jewish minds. Any sympathy which progressive Jews had felt then towards Antiochus's attempt to bring them into line with Greek civilization had been killed by his sacrilegious attack on their ancient faith and institutions. The Maccabean War of Independence had united patriotism and conservative religion, and the Orthodox Jews of the time of Jesus were more strongly entrenched in their own ancient traditions than they had been since the time of Ezra. The high hopes of the early days of the War of Independence, when every Jew rallied to the summons of Judas Maccabeus, had been shattered by the dynastic disputes of the Maccabean family. The noble cause which had called forth the book of Daniel was now seen to be a self-seeking struggle for power on the part of those who followed Judas as heads of state. At length, in 63 BC, the Romans were invited to arbitrate between the rival factions. And having once got a foothold in Palestine, they took good care not to be dislodged. The story of the next 100 years is one of increasingly bad relations between the Jews and their Roman masters, ending in the terrible war of AD 66 to 70, which resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the devastation of the whole country. Jesus was born in a land about the size of Wales, a tiny part of the far-flung Roman dominions. It was also, as far as the Romans were concerned, the most irritating thorn in the flesh. They'd established a monarchy, subject of course to Rome, under Herod the Great, who had adopted the Jewish religion, although not a Jew by birth. His allegiance was to Rome, and his sympathies were Greek, which was hardly a combination to endear him to his subjects. He undoubtedly won their approval by taking in hand the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem, but this approval was tempered by the heavy taxation he imposed to pay for it, and the Roman eagle which he insisted on putting above the door. The Jews certainly didn't approve of his new Greek-style towns with their pagan temples, or of his splendid marble and gold palace in Jerusalem, built at public expense, or of the theatre and amphitheatre for games and gladiatorial displays, which he erected just outside the city walls. The less militant members of the Jewish community confined their protest to passive resistance. More fiery characters expressed their feelings more violently, and Herod's reign was marked by the ruthless suppression of disaffected elements by means of massacres and crucifixions. One can well understand how a man of this sort, who by the end of his reign had become quite mad, could have been responsible for the mass murder of the children of Bethlehem, from which the infant Jesus was saved. On his death in 4 BC, the Jews besought the emperor to take the country under direct Roman supervision. They'd had enough of Herod. The Emperor Augustus, however, preferred to divide the territory among Herod's 3 sons. As it happened, the one who was made ruler of Judea, the most important section of the country, with Jerusalem, the capital, in the heart of it, was the worst of the 3. After 10 years of riots, rebellion, and merciless reprisals, the emperor yielded to the Jewish pleas and placed Judea under the control of a Roman procurator, who was to be responsible to the provincial governor of Syria and through him to Augustus himself. Procurators were not officials of high standing in the Roman administration. They were sometimes appointed to trouble spots in the empire's more backward colonies, and Palestine was obviously one of these. The 5th procurator to be put in charge of Judea was Pontius Pilate, who took office in AD 26, and thus had the power of life and death in his hands at the trial of Jesus. The Herod who features most in the Gospels was Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, who was ruler of Galilee, the part of Palestine to which Jesus belonged. He was bent on getting rid of Jesus, who described him as that fox, and he had already caused the murder of John the Baptist, who had condemned him for his bigamous marriage with Herodias. Pontius Pilate's record, too, is a black one. His method of government was brutal repression, and he was eventually tried in Rome for massacring civilians without sufficient cause, and was banished to Gaul. The gospel story is thus played out in a land which was seething with unrest, badly governed and stained with blood. Apart from the Herods, who, although powerful enough, were merely the nominal rulers, the real clash was between Roman authority and Jewish religious scruples. The Romans were, on the whole, just and tolerant, if unimaginative masters of their subject peoples. So long as law and order were observed, they held their provinces on a light rein and allowed the natives reasonable freedom. What they couldn't understand was what they regarded as the religious fanaticism of the Jews. Complaints against heavy taxation were understandable. This was a crushing burden at the time of Jesus, and the publicani, or government tax collectors, who lived mainly by extortion in addition to their normal dues, were regarded as rogues and bracketed with sinners in popular thought. It was also understandable to the Romans that the Jews should yearn for the independence they had enjoyed under Judas Maccabeus. Likewise, Romans could understand unrest which sprang from poverty and malnutrition as a result of bad harvests. What they couldn't understand, however, was a people who regarded an image of the divine emperor as an affront to God, whose law forbade the worship of all graven images, who denounced theatres and athletic stadia as hotbeds of immorality, and rose in revolt at the use of money filched from the temple treasury to pay for an aqueduct. Naturally, all this was seen by the Romans as sheer obscurantism and opposition which they couldn't comprehend, and so they used increasingly stern methods to suppress it. It's not surprising that the pages of the Gospels are studded with so many cases of mental disorder and disease. Ever since their return from the Babylonian exile, the Jews had tended to become more and more a theocracy, governed by priests in accordance with the divine law as contained in the sacred scriptures. The high priest in Jerusalem had become the effective head of state, and under Roman administration this continued, subject only to the ultimate authority of the procurators. The two high priests who are mentioned in the Gospels, Annas and Caiaphas, were obviously powerful figures in the community. Annas was in office from AD 6 to 15, and his son-in-law Caiaphas ruled from AD 18 to 36. Under them, the chief legislative body was the Sanhedrin, whose leading members are described in the Gospels as the chief priests. Judicial matters which could not be settled by local tribunals were referred to the Sanhedrin, which was in effect the supreme court in all Jewish affairs, except in the case of capital offences. High priests and chief priests were recruited from the party of the Sadducees, who are linked in the Gospels with the Pharisees as the two dominant religious groups in the time of Jesus. Both parties had grown up since the time of the Maccabean War. The Sadducees were wealthy, aristocratic, and highly unpopular. They'd been in their early days the progressive faction, favouring the adoption of Greek practices. And although Antiochus' policies had alienated their sympathies, they were still regarded as tainted with foreign ideas. The popular view was that they were too friendly with the Roman government and avoided a clash in order to keep themselves in power. The Pharisees, on the other hand, had a much better record. They were mostly laymen and included a wide range of people of differing types. They had always been identified with Jewish national aspirations and had always been stout defenders of the unique character of Israel's heritage of faith and practice. They numbered among them the more militant young Jews who kept up a running battle against the Romans or the Herods, or whoever seemed to be standing in the way of freedom. These Maccae called themselves zealots, and one of them, Simon by name, became a disciple of Jesus. Their revolutionary tactics were deplored by the more moderate members of the community who called them robbers, since not only the Romans but also the wealthy were their targets. Many of them ended up on a cross by the wayside, like the two who were crucified at the same time as Jesus. On the other hand, the party of the Pharisees included the solid middle class, patriotic but law-abiding, hating Roman oppression but avoiding open conflict. Yet Jesus, according to the Gospels, had little to say in favour of the Pharisees. It was not the young zealots who roused his ire, or the quiet middle-of-the-road men and women who belonged to this party. His strictures were directed at those Pharisees who claimed to be the public guardians of religion and morals, who set themselves up as examples of godly living, and made the warm humanity of Israel's historic faith a miserable matter of pettifogging adherence to a soulless code of legalistic observances. We ended the last chapter where we saw the massive legacy that Christianity has received from the Old Testament, with the question why Jesus should nevertheless have had so little to say in favour of the religious atmosphere in which he grew up? The answer is that although there were doubtless some worthy Sadducees and Pharisees in his day, the policy of both parties had resulted in a religion which was a travesty of what the psalmists, prophets, and sages of the Old Testament had stood for. As we shall see, the Sadducees, who controlled the temple at Jerusalem, where generations of Israelites had felt themselves to be in the very presence of God, had turned this great national shrine into a commercial racket and a public fairground. The scribes, or rabbis of the Pharisaic party, who influenced society greatly through the synagogues, offered people a bleak and sterile creed and commended as the good life a dreary pattern of thou shalt nots, which had no relevance to the real needs of ordinary people who were looking for help and guidance in the daily battle of living in a frightening world.